Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to our webinar, a look at the Economic Research Services Commodity Cost and Returns Data. My name is Valerie Negron, and I will be your host today. This webinar is being recorded and will be posted on the ERS website next week. At any time during the webinar, you may enter a question into the chat feature at the bottom left corner of your screen, and our speaker will answer questions at the end of the presentation. Our speaker today is Samantha Padilla. Samantha is a research agricultural economist with our Markets and Trade Economics division. Her research interests center on production economics, farm input markets, technology adoption, agricultural policy, and economic development. Samantha holds a PhD in agricultural, food, and resource economics from Michigan State University, and a bachelor's degree in economics from St. Mary's University. Thanks for joining us today, Samantha. We're ready for you to begin.
Thank you for the introduction, Valerie, and welcome everyone. Good afternoon, and today we will be talking about the Commodity Cost and Returns Data product. I will be talking to you about why these estimates are important, some of the examples of the current estimates, how we calculate them, and how you can access them in the ERS website. So let us begin with a small introduction about the Commodity Cost and Returns Data product. So the ERS Economic Research Service calculates how much it costs to produce certain commodities and the expected returns of production every year for 12 different commodities. These estimates have been put out on our website since 1975, and they are updated twice a year. So when we mean estimates, some of the things that we calculate are operating costs that can be thought of as variable expenses such as seed, fertilizer, and fuel, allocated overhead, things that are usually considered an opportunity cost, or general farm overhead such as taxes, insurance, and building maintenance, and the value of production. So this includes things like yields, prices, and quantities sold for the different commodities. So right off the bat, I want to talk to you about why these estimates are important. So in order to design targeted agricultural policy that is going to support farmers today and in the future, policymakers and USDA need to have estimates on how much it costs to produce certain commodities. In order to forecast costs for the next 10 years and see the uncertainties and major forces that can affect agricultural markets and farmers, we need these estimates. So that is the policy reason as to why these are important. On the sense of the estimates, these are important because they are used by everyone, academics, students, policymakers, and even local governments to inform on what is happening in the United States and in these 12 commodities. We calculate these estimates for the U.S., for different regions, and for some states and size estimates that are representative of commodity producers. We use survey data that some universities and budgets might not have access to, and this is what makes our estimates unique and important. So now that I've hopefully conveyed the importance of these estimates, let's talk about and discuss what I mean by 12 commodities. So these are the 12 commodities that we put out estimates for. Today, I will be talking to you about mostly cotton. An example of a livestock enterprise would be milk, and I'll talk a little bit about the wheat estimates. But all of them represent important major U.S. commodities that affect states and communities throughout the United States. So here's a little bit of an overview of the current May estimates. So as I mentioned earlier, we released these estimates in May and October. We just released the 2020 estimates last week. So these are some of the changes in the value of production less operating costs that we saw between 2019 and 2020. And let's decompose a little bit what I mean by value of production. So value of production in this case is almost like a measure of revenue. Less operating costs, so minus operating costs would be all the variable expenses. And for things like commodities, crop commodities, we mean the cost of fertilizer, the cost of seed, the cost of chemicals, and these in a sense are a measure of profit. So as you can see, for barley, corn, cotton, oats, wheat, in hogs, there was a decline in the value of production less operating costs between 2019 and 2020. The largest of these declines was seen in cotton, and I will decompose a little bit about why we saw these declines in the estimates and hopefully show you some supporting evidence as to why these estimates make sense. On the livestock side, we saw a huge increase in cow-calf. So an important aspect about these estimates is that I can tell you what changed within an estimate. I can change you what price is driving what we're seeing, what yield. Is it operating costs that are changing? Is it the gross value of production that is changing? But really the reason driving that change, whether it's a weather change or maybe some sort of shock that is happening to a certain region that is affecting the price, that is really up to the researchers to dive in and really decompose why are we seeing these changes and provide trend analysis and studies to show how these changes affect the U.S. and regions differently. So I mentioned earlier that the ERS provides regional estimates on the cost of production. And the regions that we use are the ERS farm regions that were developed in early 2000s. So these regions take into account local differences in soils and, more importantly, in the specialization of a region in different types of commodities. So the old ERS regions would be determined by states. So a couple of states would be aggregated together, and it wouldn't really account for any terrain differences or soil or even the different types of commodities. So a region might have produced a lot of different things, and it wouldn't really make sense to aggregate it that way. But with the access to county level data, we can better decompose and create regions that really speak to the estimates and commodities that we're trying to represent. So an example about why regional analysis is really important when looking at costs and returns for certain commodities would be an example for barley. So this is showing the operating costs for different regions for barley in 2020. So as you can see, the vertical line is showing the United States first, followed by the region Fruitful Rim, followed by Basin Range, Northern Crescent, and the Northern Great Plains. And on the horizontal axis, we have dollars per acre planted in cost. So these bars represent all the operating costs that each region face. And as you can see, the Fruitful Rim, the second bar, it has a lot higher operating costs compared to the Northern Great Plains, so the last bar. So if we were just to look at the United States and see the dollars per acre planted, we would miss the variation that exists in these costs and how important it is to know what's happening in certain regions, you know, what's happening with the weather, what's happening with prices in that region that is driving these estimates. So this is a real benefit of the commodity cost and returns that ERS produces, that we can do regional analysis and really understand what is driving these changes across different regions in the U.S. So let's dive in. We're going to begin with my personal favorite. This is an example of the current estimates for cotton. And what I'm showing you here is the value of production less operating costs. So just a little reminder what I mean by value of production in the context of cotton, it would be the yield for cotton times the price plus the yield of cottonseed plus times the price of cottonseed added together. So that would be the value of production in this context, minus the operating costs would be, again, things like how much the farm spent on seed, fertilizer, and chemicals. So the horizontal axis is demonstrating dollars per acre planted, and then the horizontal axis is demonstrating the regions, and then the vertical axis is demonstrating dollars per acre planted. And the first set of columns is the United States, where the orange column represents the value of production minus operating costs in 2019, and the blue column represents the value of production in operating costs in 2020. So just really decomposing the differences and calculating the percent changes, we can see that the United States experienced a 32% decline in the value of production minus operating costs. And that is the same number that I showed you in the highlights a couple of slides back. But what is really driving that change? So as we can see, some regions in the United States, such as the Heartland, the second set of columns in this chart, really improved their value of production minus operating costs. But other regions, such as the Prairie Gateway, the third region in the chart, and the Fruitful Rim, the fifth region in the chart, experienced a big declines in the value of productions that are really driving what we're seeing overall in the United States. So let us dive into why we observe these changes and why these estimates might be supported by information created by researchers. So a deeper dive into cotton. So this is an example of a table that you can see if you download our product in the ERS website. I have removed some of the rows to make it easier to read and understand. So the first three rows represent the gross value of production, first for the primary product, which is cotton, and then the secondary product, which is cottonseed, and then those two are added together and it's the gross value of production. Then the next row represents the total operating cost. I have not shown all the operating costs because they're expensive and I wanted to make sure that the point really comes across. And then the last column in the top part of the table is the value of production less operating costs. So let's begin with the United States. The first column to the left, it represents the estimates for 2019, and the column to the right represents the estimates for 2020. So as you can see, the gross value of production for the United States went from $513.87 to $449.10. We saw a big decline in that category. So in order to really calculate value of production, we have to look at gross value of production and operating costs. So what are we seeing in operating costs? So if we look below on the text box highlighted for the United States, we actually see that operating costs declined between 2019 and 2020. So they went from $427.21 to $390.57. So we know that if we are looking for what is driving the value of production minus operating costs, it won't be operating costs since they're actually declining, but we're seeing a decline in the gross value of production. And a similar story can be seen for the Prairie Gateway region and the Fruitful Rim. So these are the two regions to the right of the chart, the last two, and they show a similar story. We see that the gross value of production declined from $301.43 for the Prairie Gateway region in 2019 to $241.65 in 2020. Similarly, the Fruitful Rim had dollars per acre planted of $731.56 to $618.23. And as we can see, operating costs also declined. So those went from $263.21 for the Prairie Gateway region in 2019 to $244.26 in 2020 for that same region. And for the Fruitful Rim, we saw a decline from $636.65 to $598.90. So when we're looking at the value of production, we know that we have to really decompose what's happening with the gross value of production. And as I mentioned earlier, what really goes into the calculation of gross value of production is cotton yield, price, cottonseed yield, and price. So as you can see for these regions, the price in dollars per pound has actually increased for the United States as a whole, the Prairie Gateway region, and the Fruitful Rim. So in the supporting information part of this chart, this would be the second row, price dollars per pound. So for the United States, that would be 61 cents dollars per pound. and it increased to 63 cents. So for the gateway region, it increased from 57 cents to 58 cents. And for the fruitful rim, it increased from 80 cents to 82. So what is really driving that negative change that we saw in the United States is not price, it is actually cotton yield. So as you can see, cotton yield in pounds per acre per planted acre decreased from 695 to 579 for the United States. And similarly, for the other two regions, we also saw a decline of almost 100 pounds per planted acre in the Prairie Gateway region and of almost 76 pounds per acre planted for the Fruitful Rim region. So this can be seen in the first row under supporting information. So what is really happening in these regions? And we can really look at the USDA cotton outlook for February 2021. And we know that a possible explanation for what we're seeing is that the abandonment rate, and what I mean by abandonment rate is when a farmer goes to the field and they decide to plant the field, they prep it, but then when it comes time to harvest, they don't harvest. So they let the field planted but not harvested. And a possible explanation as to why they decided to abandon is because maybe the cost of harvesting would outweigh what they would get if they were to harvest and sell the product. So the abandonment rate in the United States climbed to 28% in 2020, and the 3-year average for the previous 3 years was 19%. And specifically for 2019, it was 15%. So that really is driving the decrease in the pounds per acre, per planted acre that we're seeing in the estimates. So here is a clear example where we have the estimates and we have existing research that supports our estimates. So let us transition into a livestock enterprise. And the example I have for you today is dairy farms. So an interesting notion that we often think with dairy farms is economies of scale. So here I have a chart showing gross value of production and cost. So this is demonstrated by farm size. So if you look at the horizontal axis, you see different classifications for farms. So the first one is farms that have fewer than 50 cows, followed by farms that have 50 to 99 cows, 100 to 199 cows, all the way up to more than 2,000 cows. So the first column is demonstrating the gross value of production, and that is in the color blue. And what is interesting about the gross value of production estimate is that for farms that have fewer than 50 cows, they get $24.18 per 100 weight sold, while farms that have over 2,000 cows, so all the way to the right in the chart, they get $19.81 per 100 weight sold. So this is an example of where we can see something really interesting that doesn't really convey the entire story. So what I mean by that is that, yes, so some of the reasons why farms with fewer than 50 cows might realize a higher revenue is because almost 20% of their milk sales come from organic milk, and that carries a higher price premium than conventional milk, while larger farms have less than 5% sales in organics. So yes, that might indicate that it might be better to have a small dairy farm, but as we know from a recent report in U.S. dairy farming, so this would be the consolidation in U.S. dairy farming released in July 2020, we know that there's really a big benefit to economies of scale that larger farms realize over smaller farms. So as you can see, here we have a chart where the horizontal axis is showing showing the base year starting in 2005 all the way to 2018. And on the vertical axis, we have dollars per 100 weight sold. So the light blue line demonstrates farms that have between 50, so the net returns for farms that have between 50 and 99 cows, while the dark blue line shows the net returns for farms that have over 999 cows. So what this is really showing is that on average, larger farms have lower production costs than smaller farms. And these differences are substantial and consistent across different herd sizes. So if you look at this chart, you see that as the number of cows in a farm increase, the net returns also increase consistently. Even though smaller farms, on average, might realize higher gross value of production per 100 weight of milk sold. So this is a more complete story where you don't necessarily always need to look at the returns, but you need to look at the combination of returns, costs and returns to really understand how a sector is changing and how a sector varies by size or by region or even by state. So I want to continue the examples for the May estimates looking at wheat farms, and I specifically want to look at the Prairie Gateway region. So as you can see in the map, that this would be in the center of the United States, covering Texas, Oklahoma. And why is this region important in this example? So I apologize for the small graph, but bear with me. As you can see, the United States had a decline in the value of production less operating costs. So this can be found in the blue box highlighted, so towards the end of the graph. And it has the similar format as the cotton table that shows 2019 and then 2020. As you can see, for the first two columns, there is a decline in the value of production less operating costs from $120.40 to $116.45. And looking at all the other regions, and we'll look at them together, no other region had experienced this decline except the Prairie Gateway region. So looking at the Northern Great Plains, which would be the next set of columns, it went, in 2019, it went from $129.61 to $144.92. Then our region of interest, which is the Prairie Gateway region, so the third set of columns, would be going from $87.02 to $55.86. And similarly, the Basin and Range also experienced an increase compared, as did the Northern Great Plains, and it went from $186.92 in 2019 to $194.41 in 2020. The Fruitful Rim also saw an increase of $11.21, so it went from $200.18 to $211.21. The Northern Crescent region, which is the second to last column starting on the right, went from $194.72 to $249.36. And then finally, the Heartland region in 2019 went from $138.67 to $199.05. So as I mentioned earlier, the only region that experienced a decline was the Prairie Gateway region, and that is really driving what we're seeing in the United States. So that $4 decline in the value of production minus operating costs. So if we look closely again at the Prairie Gateway region, we can understand what is driving that decline, and it would either be the gross value of production or total operating costs. So the gross value of production, so this would be the price of wheat times the wheat harvested, plus the straw and grazing times the price of the straw and grazing added together. And that went from $192.30 to $159.54. So So we're really seeing a decline here. And on the other hand, looking at operating costs, we see a decline. So we know that the difference between 2019 and 2020 in terms of value of production minus operating costs is being driven by the gross value of production declining. So over here, it again comes to the story of yields. So yields went from 44 bushels per planted acres to 36.02 bushels per planted acres, while price actually for wheat actually increased. So what's really driving is a change in yields. So this is an example, This is an example of a region that in a commodity that experienced a decline that we observe and that it's driving the decline that we see in the United States in terms of value of production minus operating costs, but there is no ongoing research that would explain why we see this decline. And here is where we work with researchers, extension agents, to try to understand what really happened in that period that we saw a decline in yields. Was it, a freeze or a rain or something that would change yields by that much? So I invite researchers to question this and use these estimates to develop interesting questions and interesting results that could explain these estimates. So now that we've talked about a little bit on what we saw in the current estimates, I want to discuss what data do we use. So a real benefit of the commodity cost and return estimates is that we use survey data to inform our estimates and to derive our estimates from what farmers actually use, what they report they used, and the quantities of inputs that they use in their farm. So the first major source of data that we use is the Agricultural Resource Management Survey, known as ARM. And this is a survey that happens every year, and commodity-specific versions of the survey are conducted on rotations from 4 to 8 years. So this survey is jointly administered by USDA ERS and the USDA National Agricultural Statistics Service, NASS. And we're the ones that put out the survey and get information from farmers this way. So the second main source of information that we use is other NASS data on current prices and yields for non-survey year estimates. So here I've introduced a term that I have not talked about, non-survey year estimates. So what I mean by non-survey year is an update year. So I will explain this difference in the context of corn. So corn farmers were last surveyed in 2016. So this is where NASS sent enumerators into the field, and they collected information from farmers, and they filled the ARMS survey, and then we used the answers from the survey directly, and we created survey year estimates. So after 2016, we used those estimates as a base and used price indices and other data to update these 2016 survey year estimates for 2017, 2018, 2019, and 2020. So those estimates for the years that we do not have a year survey are called update year estimates. So how do we develop these estimates? And this is a very important question, because when you think of cost, there's so many different ways that you can try to approach in developing a cost. Like, what do I use? What a farmer is telling me that they spent on seed, or do I find prices of seed and try to get an average of how much seed is used on fields? And there's just many ways that you can use information available to develop these estimates. However, here at ERS, we use the American Agricultural Economics Association, AAEA, Task Force Handbook on Commodity Costs and Returns. So this was first developed in 1996 by a joint effort of USDA, academics, and extension specialists from Langland University. And really the beauty of this is that everything is standardized and it's based on economic theory. So they decided that it would be beneficial to have a way that people can approach these estimates, and no matter like what commodity you want to study or what crop you want to study, you can refer to the handbook and you'll know exactly how we generated those cost and return estimates and what kind of theory is behind the estimates we develop. So there are 4 different estimation methods that we use. The first one is direct costing, followed by valuing input quantities, indirect costing, and then allocating whole farm expenses. And this is really where I wanted to point out that there's many different ways to get at a cost, and we use these 4 methods depending on the type of information we have available to us. So direct costing, this basically is the when we take survey responses to questions and about the amounts paid for each input, and we use that as the estimate. We take the average, and that is the estimate spent, for example, on seed or fertilizer or even purchased water. The second type of method is valuing input quantities. So this would be, for example, if we take survey data on the quantities of something used, and then we multiply it with secondary data on input prices. So a good example of this would be land. So you might already own the land that you use for your field, and you might not have a cash expense for that, but for our estimates, we still need to know the opportunity cost of the land. So we would find out how much land was used for a certain commodity, and we would multiply it by a rental rate to find out how much it costs to produce. And how much was the cost of land, even though there was no cash expense the farm incurred for land. And this is really important because it gets at the idea of opportunity cost. So what is the second best use that you can do for land? So if you're a farmer and you own the land, you could potentially rent it out to someone. You could sell it, you could convert it into something that's not cropland. There's many alternatives that you can use, and we want to account for those alternatives when we're calculating these costs. So the third method that we use is indirect costing. So this is when we combine information from production practices and technical information from the machine, such as how much it's being used, how old it is, what model, and we put all that information into engineering formulas to determine things like the cost of replacing your machinery or fuel expenses would go in here, drying equipment and things like that have to do with machine performance, and mostly imputing it into engineering formulas. Finally, we have allocating whole farm expenses. And this relates to the idea that you can't really attribute, for example, the taxes that you pay on the entire farm to a specific commodity. You can't say, well, my farm is mostly corn and soybeans, but I think corn is more important, so all the costs would be allocated to corn. So what we use is an allocation scheme, and basically we estimate how much of the total farm operating margin, and this is value of production minus operating costs, each commodity represents. So if, for example, corn represents 30% of the total farm operating margin, 30% of the farm overhead costs would be attributed to corn. So that would be taxes and insurance, the cost of repairing buildings, things that are usually included in farm overhead. So I want to conclude this presentation by talking about how we can access the data. And if you know our website, www.ers.usda.gov, you can access it from clicking on the data product column, and then really clicking on any one of these topics: animal products, corn, farm economy would take you to a list of data products. So once you click on that, you can scroll down and look for commodity costs and returns. So this is how our website looks in this specific data product. And to the left, we can see an overview, the interactive visualization, which I'll talk about in a bit, readings and documentation. So if you click on readings, you can see some of the more recent reports that feature our data product. Documentation, this is where most of the information from this presentation comes from. You can access, what each term means, the regions, and what kind of costs we develop with each method. You can also access the task force, the AEDA task force manual that we use to calculate our estimates. If you click on that, it will take you to a different page, but it's free to download. And you can access, right below the ERS Farm research regions. And I point this out because if you want to look at earlier estimates, earlier than 2000, you can also access our old ERS regions and understand estimates using those regions as well. So back to the base page, if you click on recent costs and returns, it will take you to something like this. So each of these files represents an Excel file. And as you can see, it was last updated on May 3rd, 2021, and the next update would be in October 1st. Once you click on that, it will download an Excel file, and you can access the data as a pivot table to facilitate, charts and understanding of the data. So a very special tool that we have in the ERS website is our interactive data visualization. So this allows you to create queries to look at different costs and returns, compare different regions for some of the raw field commodities. So how do you access this visualization tool is you go to our base page for the commodity costs and returns, and to the left on the second option, there's the interactive visualization, U.S. commodity costs and returns by region and by commodity field crops. So you can here click the different types of costs and returns that you want to look at and the different commodities. So this is showing the corn farmers that we surveyed in the different regions. And it's showing since the first was selected crop costs and returns, you can see a chart showing just that. So the gross value of production, operating costs, and costs listed. And if you want to download this information, you can go to the bottom right corner and click on the middle button. So it looks like a box with a pointing down arrow. And that will prompt you to select a type of download that you can get. So this would be the type of file that you want your data specified in. So a takeaway from the commodity cost and returns data product that I want you to remember from this presentation is that it's based on information provided by farmers. It is easy to access on our website, and you can find specifically how we calculate any costs and the rationale that we use behind each cost, and that these tools that we use are standardized methods that were developed by experts in the field and that really take into account economic theory behind the estimation of these costs, and that they're important building blocks for research and policy. They're used throughout the United States, and they're important points of starting when you're really thinking about what's changing in a commodity in terms of cost and return. So with that, I conclude my presentation, and I thank you very much for being here with me today.
Thank you, Samantha. Looks like we have some questions coming in, but before we begin, I'd like to introduce four of our colleagues who will be supporting Samantha with today's question. With us today, we have Acting Branch Chief of the Animal Products and Cost of Production Branch, Senior Economist Jeffrey Gillespie, Agricultural Economist Amy Boline, Research Agricultural Economist Kate Back-Norris, and last but not least, Research Economist Monty Van Devere. Thank you all for joining us today. Now, for our first question, Samantha, can you explain more about how the estimates differ between survey years and years in which they are updated?
Thank you. So on the years between survey years, on the survey year estimates, we try We use our survey to develop the estimates, and on the years when there is no survey, we use the base survey estimates that we have, and we combine it with information from NASS. So that would be, for example, the price indices for seed, for fertilizer, the changes in the wage rate that we're seeing that year, and the harvest price for different months to try to get the estimates to be consistent across years.
Perfect. Our next question is, do your costs and returns estimates include crop insurance and government farm programs?
Thank you for that question. I think this question would be best be answered by my colleague Monty.
Yes, thank you, Sam. No, we do not include crop insurance or government farm programs in the cost and production estimates. We're just looking at costs and returns that are directly related to the farm and not from a government source.
Thank you, Monty. Next question. Are historical ERS commodity data adjusted for inflation? If not, what index would you recommend using to adjust them?
Thank you. My colleague Jeff Gillespie will answer this question.
Yes, there in the past, I think what I've seen in some of our publications, what we've used is NASS prices paid index for this type of for detrending in this way. So that's one way. That would probably be a good one to use.
Thank you, Jeff. Next question. Does the USDA do commodity cost of production estimates for other countries as well?
Thank you for the question. Unfortunately, we only provide estimates within our branch. In this data product, we only provide estimates for the commodity cost and returns for U.S. farms and regions.
Okay, next question. Are estimates available for all farm resource regions for each of the commodities?
Not necessarily. That depends on how many survey responses we get for each region. So there's a minimum number of survey responses that we need to get in order to, report, for example, corn estimates for the fruitful rim region. So to answer your question, it depends on what survey responses we get.
Perfect. Thank you, Samantha. Next question. Do you publish state-level estimates?
We publish state-level estimates for dairy estimates only.
Next question. Are the cost and return estimates used in any forecasting?
Thank you. I will let my colleague Amy answer this question.
Thanks, Sam. So yes, the cost and returns data is used we produce a 2-year forecast twice a year, so December and June. You can find those on the website, the same website where our cost and returns are that Sam told you how to get to it, and then we also help out with the ERS's long-term ag baseline projections, which is a 10-year forecast.
Thank you, Amy. Next question. Can the commodity cost and returns data be used to examine differences in cost and returns by production system, such as organic versus non-organic?
I will pass the mic to my colleague, Jeff Gillespie.
Yes, the cost of production team has conducted research comparing cost and returns by production system. For example, on our cost and returns website and webpage, You'll find milk, wheat, soybean, and corn cost and return estimates by organic versus conventional production system. Similar types of analyses can also be conducted for other systems as well. If the system is, say, queried within the ARMS survey.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Our next question is, why does USDA include land costs in its commodity cost, even if the land is fully owned by the operator?
This is really to get at the idea that the estimates that we produce with ERS include economic costs instead of accounting costs. So what we're really trying to estimate here are not necessarily only cash expenses that the farm incurred, but the opportunity costs or the second best option that might come with that. So in terms of land, the farmer if he owns or he or she owns the farm, they can sell it, they can rent it, they can do many other things instead of farming the land. So what we're really trying to get at, first of all, is the true cost incurred by anyone of planting or harvesting that commodity. And that includes the potential cost of, doing something else with the land. Also, I want to add that our estimates are not only they're used by people maybe that want to go into business of certain commodities. They are used by people that are trying to understand these changes, and not every farmer owns the land that they use. So it's important to consider, well, if I want to get into business, I'm going to have to rent land or buy it, and that's an important cost in factoring the budget that I need to spend on engaging in this type of business.
Thank you, Sam. That's very interesting. Our next question up is, will the cost and returns data be available at the county level?
Thank you. I will let my colleague Jeff Gillespie answer this question.
No, we don't generally have not made those kinds of data available. We've not had. You have to have enough. For one thing, you have to have enough observations in order to be able to provide an estimate, and we typically would not have enough observations to provide a county level estimate for any commodity.
Thank you, Jeffrey. Next question is, how do you estimate fertilizer costs?
Thank you for the question. My colleague, Kate Vignoris, is best suited to answer this question. Kate?
Thanks, Sam. So for fertilizer costs, we use a combination of two methods that Sam mentioned in her presentation. Generally, for the majority of observations, we use direct costing. So the ARMS survey just asks farmers directly how much did they spend on fertilizer in their field for that commodity in that year. Sometimes farmers don't provide this information, so we also, for those that are missing this information, we value input quantities, so that we also ask farmers to give information on every fertilizer application on their field for that year. So that includes total quantity of each different nutrient. And then we use state-level nutrient prices to calculate those costs, and we sum it up for the field. So that allows us to get that information for the farmers that don't provide the direct costing information.
Thanks, Kate. Our next question is on farms. Dairy farms continue to expand in size. How might one use the commodity costs and returns data to examine the size of farms where economies of scale are exhausted?
Thank you. My colleague Jeff Gillespie will answer this question.
Yes, the cost and returns data can be used to examine cost economies of size by commodity. I mean, it could potentially be able to do this for any of these commodities, but I think this was specifically for dairy. And so, for example, on the milk cost of production website, which can be reached through our commodity cost and returns website, you can see cost and returns estimates for milk by farm size. And we have a number of different size categories there. I think it's net less than 50 cows, 52, 99 cows, 100 to 199 cows, and on up to over 2,000 cows. And that type of analysis, I mean, you can compare those cost and returns for each one of those categories, and that can be, as I said, it can be conducted for other commodities as well by sorting the data in the different size categories. There would be other ways also to do it, but that's one way to do it that you can see directly on our website.
Thanks, Jeffrey. Here's a question from one of our USDA colleagues. Do you publish survey questions and survey results, including response rates and weighting of responses to arrive at what you end up publishing?
So we do publish the questionnaires. We do publish the questionnaires for each of the commodity surveys and our Phase 3 survey for ARMS that can be found in the ERS website. And I think the best way to find information on response rates would be to access the NASS website, and they are the ones that put out any sort of information on response rates and it reports as to what is happening with ARMS. We only publish in our website the questionnaires and for both Phase 2 and Phase 3.
Thanks, Sam. How do you estimate homegrown feed cost and grazing costs for livestock and dairy?
Thank you. Jeff Gillespie will answer this question.
Yes, we is for homegrown. We do not estimate actually the cost of producing homegrown feed, but instead we are using sort of the valuing input quantities procedures for that. We ask how much of each of these different feeds that are fed to animals was grown on the farm, and then we then value that feed at its market price. So that's how we do homegrown feed. I think you asked about grazed feed as well, and for grazed feed, we determine that based on the rental rate for pasture. So it's the rental rate per pasture by state is how we value grazed feed.
Thanks, Jeffrey. That's very insightful. Next question, how do you allocate costs of farm machinery and equipment over all the farm enterprises? For example, a farmer might use their tractor for several crops or livestock enterprises.
So we use the whole farm allocation method. So we calculate the total farm margin for each commodity, and we use that as a share of the total cost of using the machine. So that would be if corn represents 30% or 40% of the farm operating margin, we would use that as a baseline to say they also use 40% of the farm machinery cost and farm overhead costs.
Thank you, Samantha. We're approaching the end of the webinar, so we'll answer a few more questions. As a reminder, you can submit your questions on the left-hand side of the chat feature. Next question, Samantha. Why does USDA include unpaid labor expenses in its commodity cost? Doesn't including those overstate the cost of producing the commodity?
Thank you. This again relates to the idea of opportunity costs. So what we mean by unpaid labor is if you're the farm owner and you work on the farm, and if your family works on the farm, there is something else that they could be doing with their time that would get them some sort of income, some sort of wage. So we try to account for that and to try to get the opportunity cost of unpaid labor included in the overall expenses. And yes, it might seem like it's overestimating costs, but we're getting economic costs again, not accounting costs. So for someone who does not have, children to work on the farm or sources of unpaid labor, they would want to know how much it really costs to hire labor out and the cost of labor for producing certain commodity.
Thank you, Samantha. Looks like we can ask one more question before we conclude. Could you contrast these commodity costs and return estimates with enterprise budgets that are typically provided by universities?
ERS commodity costs and returns estimates and budgets are calculated using survey data and actual responses from farmers, and they are representative. So I will pass the question to Jeff Gillespie, who has extensive experience in estimating these costs and returns at the university level.
Yeah, thanks, Samantha. Yeah, in addition to what Samantha said, many of the enterprise budgets at universities, sometimes they're projections. And our estimates are actually for the past year, as well as historic cost of production based on our survey data. Also, another thing that's different is that most of the time the state enterprise budgets are generally state estimates, and of course what you find on our website is we typically will have, except for milk where we have state level estimates, we have either national or regional estimates, and so we do provide those national and regional estimates versus in the states where they typically will provide an estimate for their state.
Thank you, Jeff. Thank you, Samantha, and all of those who joined us today. Looks like those are all the questions we have time for today. We appreciate you all being here. As a reminder, the commodity costs and returns data product can be found on our website, ers.usda.gov. A recording and transcripts of today's webinar will also be posted to the webpage next week. And now this concludes our webinar. I hope you all have a great rest of the day. Thank you.